If you're planning on doing some landscape paintings, you're bound to eventually have to paint a tree or two, or more. For example, this current painting I'm working on has a lot of trees all the way in the distance, but today's video is not going to be about them. It's going to be about this one. Hello and welcome. My name is Charles. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I am going to demonstrate on how to paint a tree in a landscape. But before we get started, I'm going to show you 3 photos that I actually used for 3 actual paintings. One I actually filmed and did a series for. Anyhow, here are the photos. The first photo is going to be a fountain where herds of animals usually drink water from. Obviously, the fountain is the main focal point, but there's some trees in the distance. Can you see what I painted first? And here's how it looked in the end, that section. Now for the next photo, it's a picture of my bike, my custom-made Cannondale Super 6 Evo that I actually built myself. Can you tell what I painted first? And now how it looked in the end. And lastly, this is the photo I used for my painting Restless Natives. There's lots of horses, but there's even more trees. Pay attention not just to the ones in the middle ground, but also the background. Can you see what I did first for the trees? And this is how it looked in the end. There are many ways to paint a tree, but there are some simple rules that don't exactly have to be followed 100%, but they'll be very helpful in the end. The first step is to paint the background, but be mindful where you plant the trees by kind of making place markers on the canvas where the trees and major branches are going to be, as well as big bodies of leaves. And then the second step, you want to build more branches and more leaves. And use middle tones mostly. For my situation, definitely for the leaves. And don't be afraid to go dark early or light early as well, but ideally middle tones, darks, then lights. And then the final step, what I like to call everything in between. Now is the time for the darks and the lights. Be mindful of the background that the tree is originally in. You might have to redo it, whether painting part of the sky in between the branches, or in my scenario, painting part of the field. Also, edges, whether soft or hard, at the right places will help make a tree look like it belongs in the picture. I do also want to talk a little bit about the photo before we start the demonstration. It does look like a silhouette, but I'm going to take some artistic liberties to give it more of a sense of volume, especially in color, and taking advantage of using soft and hard edges, light and dark, and also warm and cool contrast in specific areas to give the tree more volume. But I will talk about that as I do the demonstration. But little details I want to point out that I'm going to try to capture are things hidden behind the tree, as well as all the twists and turns where I really believe this tree is not just one tree, but several that were bundled together and grew as one. And notice in some areas the branches are dark, and in others they're very light. It all depends on the lighting. I'll talk about that also a little more in the demonstration. Anyhow, enough talking. Let's get on with the demonstration. In the beginning stages of painting a tree, I am kind of, in a way, working more on the background, but I keep in mind where the tree will be. Therefore, I plant a trunk and some branches. In a way, a skeleton of a tree that I will later build more on top of, which is leaves and even more branches. But as of right now, it's just a place marker in the overall painting. So later, I can go back into it and detail it. For example, I still have lots of fields in the background, and some bushes, trees, and even a fence that are not as developed yet. I find that painting the negative space, which is the background, more important. That way it's easier to move forward and paint the things that are in front of the background, such as the middle ground and foreground. Don't be afraid after you paint the skeleton or framework of the tree of painting over it as you do the rest of the background. As you work the background, you might overlap a branch or two, but that's part of the process. And if you prefer, you could do an outline of the tree ahead of time or a full drawing, but if you're gonna go that route, be mindful of the branches and tree trunk, and then worry about the leaves later. It's okay to paint some of the leaves early on, especially the very dense ones where you can't actually see the background. In a way, they also act as a place marker as you build the tree. Dense leaves also help establish where the branches are as well, only that they're not as visible or not visible at all. As you're painting the background, pay attention to the lights and darks. There are a few smaller trees behind. In a way, the same thing, where I'm painting where the branches are and then adding some leaves here and there. I'm not going too much into detail. It's just the order of layers. For example, one of the trees in the back is very dark because the sun is hitting it from behind, and because of that, it's helping make the leaves on the left pop out more. To establish these tones, I'm not using black. Instead, I'm using a mixture of alizarin crimson and viridian. And while the paint is still wet, I'm trying to paint in some leaves. I am trying to establish the background before I move forward with the main tree that's in focus today in this video. The same dark from that tree I'm using to carve out little branches. In a way, I'm painting the negative space to form that branch and leaves. While the paint is still wet in that dark area, I'm trying to paint some of the little details that are visible. Because the paint is wet, the edges are softer, and this is a good thing when you're trying to push things into the distance. I don't want that section to stand out too much. And as for the leaves that are very bright against the field, later on during the painting process, I found that they were too similar in color. Therefore, I went back into the background with more viridian and blues and also cobalt green to cool down the field so the leaves popped out more. But instead of light and dark contrast, it was more of a warm and cool, where the warm colors pushed forward against the cools. Here I'm continuing to paint more branches. I'm trying to be accurate, but I'm not going to care too much if I make mistakes at this stages. Besides the branches, I'm also painting some of the background. It's very important to be mindful of the surrounding area of the tree, and depending on the reference photo or actual tree you're observing, look at what's visible and what's not, and plan accordingly. That's why I'm spending a great deal doing the background as I'm doing the tree itself. Again, besides some branches, I'm also painting some leaves, especially the ones that are more on the dense side. Because the sun is hitting this tree directly from behind, there are certain leaves that are going to be very bright. So from the beginning, I'm not afraid to go on the brighter side and use almost pure cadmium yellow to establish the leaves. And this is how I left the tree until I found it was time to go back into it. Instead of being a tree, it was just a place marker on my canvas. So I knew exactly where it would be when the time was right to go back into it. Even though it looks like a silhouette at first glance, there are some lights and darks in the tree. So I'm being mindful of the twists and turns. I'm not certain about the history of it, but it does look like it's several trees that were bundled together and grew as one. So in a way, I'm trying to establish that appearance by sculpting the trunk and some of the branches with dark tones and some light tones. I do want this tree to have a sense of volume in the end. I'm also going back into some of the branches and enhancing them and making them a little more darker. Because I'm moving on from the background, now I'm trying to make the tree more permanent on the canvas, instead of it being a temporary place marker. Because the tree is so close, it's going to have a lot of sharper edges than stuff in the background. And depending where some of the branches are, some might have softer edges. But for the most part, they're going to be sharper because they're going to have to stand out from the other trees and bushes that are behind. I'm also going back into some of the branches and enhancing them and making them a little more darker. Because I'm moving on from the background, now I'm trying to make the tree more permanent on the canvas, instead of it being a temporary place marker. Besides adding more detail to the background, the other thing I was focusing on was the temperature. Sometimes things need to be cooled down or warmed up in order to establish a sense of depth and distance. For example, I still thought that the field behind the tree was still too warm, so I started to apply more cooler tones again. I've been experimenting with cobalt green recently, and I'm starting to really like the color. It's a nice cool green that's very muted, and I feel it's a perfect color to push things in the back that are green. So I carefully paint between the branches and cool down the field, and because the paint will be wet, it will also help me with some softer edges, particularly the ones that I want to recede and not stand out as much. Since I already established the main branches of the tree, adding more branches like the little ones is a lot easier. Keep in mind, some branches are just clusters of leaves. Even though you don't see the actual twigs or branch, it probably is hidden underneath all the leaves. Right now, what I'm trying to do is build more branches on the right side of the tree. I'm not copying the photo 100%. Instead, I'm trying to interpret it and paint certain branches and twigs that stand out, that are more to my liking. Some branches will be dark, some will be light. It all depends on how the light is hitting them. So pay attention to the tree or photo that you are using and paint accordingly. If it helps to understand branches better, just think of it this way: smaller branches come off of the bigger ones. So as you build those branches, create smaller ones among the bigger ones. On the left side, I'm trying to paint the tree that's hiding behind the left branch, but I'm also using darks to carve out more branches. I do want those leaves to stand out, so I'm trying to increase the contrast. You might think I'm painting leaves all the time, but in some scenarios, I'm actually carving them out. If there's a body of color that is meant for the leaves, I'm going into it and defining some of the leaves, while also adding new ones. Again, this is kind of like a tug-of-war battle with the negative space, where you add darks and then add lights, then a combination of both, where the darks carve into the light and the lights are laid on top of the darks. Let's speed through to the next section. As you can see, I'm building this section up, leaf for leaf, branch for branch. And notice I'm also going a little brighter as well, and though it's not visible, the paint is also getting a little thicker when it gets brighter, because the physical presence makes it even stand out even more. It might seem tedious, but when trying to paint the tree, some branches are going to be lighter and some are going to be darker, and also pay attention how sharp they are. Some that recede will benefit from a softer touch, while the ones that are closer to the viewing plane will stand out more if they're sharp. Same thing with the leaves. Nice sharp defined colors in the front versus softer blurry ones in the back. This will help make the tree look actually like it has volume and not a caricature. Let's speed up again. As I build the tree, I try to think of it as dressing it as well, adding some leaves here, branches there. And I'm also keeping in mind that the tree is three-dimensional and there's volume, so I'm painting it in a way where I'm intentionally going to make some of the branches and leaves stand out more and some recede, to help establish the illusion that it actually takes place in a three-dimensional world, even though it's going to be a 2D surface. Yes, it's tedious, but it's not that difficult. It just requires a lot of patience. Just like the branches, I'm not copying the leaves 100% from the photo. I'm taking the best parts that I like, and in some ways, I'm even exaggerating them, especially the brightness and darkness, all for the sake of creating a sense of volume. Think of it as artistic liberty. In the earlier stages, I would dab big bodies of color, especially for the thick clusters of leaves, but towards the end, I am more focused on individual leaves. Something I did not mention is it's okay to blur some of the leaves with a dry brush. This is sometimes necessary before you continue to layer more leaves on top of the other leaves, because the ones that are going to be blurry are going to be pushed back, and the ones that are going to be laid on top are going to be a little more on the sharper side, further establishing more volume and depth in your painting. I'm going to speed through this section, but slowly but surely, leaf by leaf, the tree will come alive. Besides repainting some of the leaves, I'm also touching up the branches, whether it's adding new ones or going back to some of the original ones. The idea behind this is to further enhance their sense of volume. So I'm focusing on darkening certain parts and also adding highlights where the light is hitting them. The branches also intertwine, so by going back into them, I'm helping establish that sense of all the twists and turns that they are making. It's an interesting tree. I kind of wish I got closer to take even better photos of it. Definitely next time, I will. Though I didn't film this part, I added more cobalt green in between some of the branches and also between some of the leaves. And while the leaves are also wet, it's not a bad idea to add more branches. Remember, the branches are not always full of leaves. Sometimes they're very barren or have very few attached to them. That's why it's not a bad idea to make more of them visible. Also, like before, I'm adding even more little tiny branches on the bigger ones. In some scenarios, they're going to be very thin and not that dark, but they're visible. Also, don't be surprised if you have to work the background again. Here I'm trying to paint some of the bushes that are hidden behind the tree. The ultimate goal, though, is to make sure the tree stands out in front of them. In ways, I'm darkening and blurring what's behind to further create an illusion of depth and distance. I'm also going to speed through this section as well. But as you can see, I'm adding more branches, more leaves, blurring when necessary, and in some scenarios, adding individual leaves that will stand out from the other ones. Like mentioned before, slowly but surely, the tree will come alive. To summarize this demonstration and tutorial, in order to paint a tree, first and foremost, consider painting the background. Second, plant the tree in an area as a place marker first in order to continue working on the background, and then go back into it. From there, build on it. Once you finish painting the background, then you go back into it, build onto the branches, the trunk, add leaves, whether it's dense big bodies of leaves or individual ones. And don't forget little tiny branches, and to give the tree a sense of depth and volume by using illusionistic techniques like blurring, sharpening, cool and warm tones, and light and dark contrast. Also, when painting the greens of the leaves, go for a middle tone first and then add the darks and lights, but don't be afraid to add lights and darks early on as well. And same thing with the background. If you have to rework it. Nothing's set in stone, and painting is always a constant form of correction. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. Hopefully you found some value in this video and learned some basic things about painting trees in a landscape. Once again, my name is Charles. I go by Bob. I'm not your typical painter. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching. Bye.